So thank you for tuning in today, everybody. We're very blessed to have the Reverend Bill Brown, former chair of the conference trustees and former mega pastor at Wesley Freedom United Methodist Church, currently the director of New Faith Expressions. And so he's going to help talk to us about best practices on selling and renting the parsonage. So looking forward to the program today.
If this works, my desktop, it is working, but let me move something over here. Perfect. Can you all see the PowerPoint? Excellent. So should you sell your parsonage? I don't know. That's what we're going to try to find out today. And we're going to cover a couple of things. An easy 4-step process. I use the word easy kind of tongue-in-cheek. It is a very detailed process that is outlined in the Book of Discipline in those following paragraphs. You'll want to be familiar with all 4 of those paragraphs. If you are an unincorporated local church, paragraph 2540 is where you'll spend most of your time. For incorporated churches, 2541. And then for everyone, 2542 talks about specifics for the sale of a church building and the sale of a parsonage. And 2543 are your restrictions on the proceeds from such sales. We'll also look at some financial considerations you'll want to keep in mind when deciding if you're going to sell your parsonage, what you can do with the proceeds of the sale. So, have to throw in a little scripture. And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Question for you today, however, does anybody know how the parsonage system or why the parsonage system was put into place? You can drop your answer in the chat if you think you know. I'm not seeing anyone in the chat. Nobody knows. Oh, a lot of people think nowadays it's to benefit the clergy, but the original parsonage system was designed to benefit the local church because local churches wanted to have their clergy accessible to themselves around the clock. And they wanted to have clergy accessible to the community around the clock. And so what better way to do that than to provide housing for the clergy person so that people could get them at any time. Oh, we do have someone in the chat. And you are correct, frequent itinerancy is another reason, particularly in the Wesleyan Methodist branch and movement. But even those churches that don't have this quick itinerancy still have the parsonage. So step-by-step process. You'll want to write this down because the details really aren't in the slide. So step 1 is consult. I just say you really need to, before you make any decisions, before you go into any details, into any study, into any length, you should consult your pastor, or if you are the pastor, consult the district superintendent and the district board of church and locations. The reason I advise people to do this at the very beginning is because those are all of the people that will have to sign off on the sale. So it's best to get them in the loop from the very beginning, get their input from the very beginning, make sure they know what's coming down the pike so that they're not surprised when the pastor asks for a special card called charge or church conference. Just consult them from the very beginning. Then you're going to want to study. I would recommend that the church council and or the board of trustees, or maybe working in conjunction, select a team of people to conduct a study. And you need to answer a couple of questions in these studies. First, you want to answer, why do we want to sell? There's the practical reasons. Do we want to sell because we can't afford the maintenance expenses anymore? Do we want to sell because our new pastor already owns their own home? Do we want to sell because we have gone from a full-time clergy person to part-time or to a lay pastor? And those are kind of the practical reasons, but more importantly, you need to have a missional reason as to why you want to sell. And that's laid out in the Book of Discipline, that the board of church and locations, the district superintendent, is going to want to know that you have a missional reason for wanting to sell a piece of property. And then some other practical questions you might need to answer are, if we sell, are there homes readily available in our community that the pastor can either purchase or rent? If a new pastor comes, can they easily buy a home in your area? Can they sell the home in the area that they're coming from? One of the interesting things about the diversity of our annual conference is the diversity of home sale prices. So if you have a clergy person who is appointed in the West Virginia part of our annual conference and are moved to the District of Columbia part of our annual conference, there's a huge disparity in the home values and home prices and the ability to sell and buy and sell in the different parts of our annual conference. And churches really should be keeping that in mind when deciding whether or not they're going to sell the parsonage. And the other big question, I think, or the final big question the church should answer is, do you expect your pastor to live in the community? In our annual conference, we have a policy that a pastor is to live within a 25-mile radius of the church. So if you're looking at your church's location and you put a pinpoint there and you draw a 25-mile radius around that, you can get an idea of the different places your clergy person could live, which may or may not be accessible to your church location. So you have to have that conversation ahead of time. After you finish the study portion, we move into the consent portion. And I would recommend that after the team is finished studying, that you hold a church council meeting or whatever your administrative structure, whoever gives those approval to things between sessions of the church or charge conference, and present your findings to the church council, the administrative board, however you're organized. And in that meeting, just get some preliminary approval. This is non-binding. This does not count towards the legal steps that the Book of Discipline requires. But in that setting, you can get an idea of where your holes are in your study, where your questions are people might have, so you can answer all of that before you come to a formal church or charge conference. But then you'll also need to get approval, written consent. Now, this is in the Book of Discipline. You have to have written consent of the pastor in charge of the local church. You'll need that to attach to the deed as part of the sale. You'll need to have written consent of the district superintendent. That also gets attached to the deed as part of the sale. And that's what releases the trust clause portion on the parsonage from the Book of Discipline, so that the person can purchase the property legally. And you'll also need to have consent from the District Board of Church and Locations. I'm going to take a breath. We're moving quickly. Take a sip of coffee. And then the final step is you get it approved, and you get it approved by a majority vote of either your regularly scheduled church or charge conference or a specially called church or charge conference. So if you're in the middle of the year, you've already had charge conference and you need to approve this, the pastor would reach out to the district superintendent in writing and request a specially called church or charge conference. If that pastor is an elder in the United Methodist Church and are given approval, then they can conduct the conference themselves, or if they're not an elder, then the district superintendent can either come or assign a presiding elder to cover that meeting. And in that meeting, you would have someone present the proposal. A resolution would have to be written up. The resolution would have to be voted on, and it would have to be a majority approval of the church or charge conference in order for it to pass. And that resolution also has to get attached to the deed and to the sales paper, just to make sure all of the steps in the Book of Discipline have been followed. And of course, if you're holding a church conference, you have to give public notice 10 days prior. That notice has to be in the form of an announcement from the pulpit. So if you're not in person worship, Zoom is your pulpit, so you can give an announcement from Zoom. And it also has to be a printed announcement, either in some form of a newsletter or bulletin, and email newsletters do count now as a printed newsletter. So those are, as I said, it's 4 easy steps. Those are the steps. I'm going to pause for a second. Oh, good question from Del Hitton. Is this prior to sell or when you're considering or at the point of sale? You may not sell. You shouldn't even list the property until church or charge conference has approved it. If that's, I hope I answered your question, Del, but really all of that should take place prior to the sale, because you don't want anything to pop up. If you list it and let's say in one day somebody puts a contract in, there aren't a lot of clauses you can use that if all of a sudden your church conference votes not to sell, how do you get out of that contract? So you want to take care of all of this ahead of time. Now, some factors, you can tell I didn't write this because all these big words. Factors to be analyzed when selling the parsonage. I want to thank Paul Eichelberger. Paul couldn't be with us this morning because he has a conference trustees meeting that he needs to attend today, but I will always throw him under the bus. These are his slides, and you can contact him about some of the answers to these questions. I'll do the best I can if you do have questions, but some things you should consider financially. Of course, let's throw some more scripture in there. Luke 14:28. For which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? There's a lost part of this verse, which it says, or if you want to sell the tower, you should sit down and analyze to make sure you have all your data. But they left that part out. So some things to do, and again, this is everything you should do before you vote to sell. Look at your current parsonage costs. How much does it cost the church, including everything? Debt, utilities, capital improvements. What's it costing per year for the to maintain the parsonage versus what does it cost for a housing allowance per year? And we just increased, I don't have the new number in front of me, but it's a little over $20,000 a year is our minimum housing allowance for the annual conference for a full-time clergy person. Then also project future parsonage costs and future housing allowances. And you really want to project out 20 to 30 years. You're going to have the house for a while. If you have full-time clergy person, you're going to be paying them a housing allowance for a while as well. And keep in mind that hopefully housing values, while they do fluctuate year over year, over longer periods of time, they tend to be higher. So if you look at the value of your house now, I'm sure it is higher than it was 20 years ago. If your house was even built 20 years ago. Mine was built in 1964. And I know the guy who built it, and it's worth more now than when he built it. As I said, include all the things: debt payments, utilities, capital improvements, everything that it costs you to maintain your parsonage year to year. Figure that into your operating costs. And as I said, if you're going to keep the parsonage, it's an investment. So what is the projected home value? You can talk to a realtor. They have their best because they're looking at this every single day because their livelihood depends on the home values, and they keep that in front of them. If you sell the parsonage, you can talk to a good investment advisor. It is not me. And they can project what the investment gains from the net proceeds could be. Again, as we know, year over year, the market goes up and down. But if you look over the long term, most investment advisors will tell you long term, the market tends to be up. And you're going to want to know what those investment gains will be. And I'll get to that in a moment. You can also, if you sell the parsonage, you'll get into this in the restrictions part in a second. You might want to also take into consideration if you sell the parsonage and use those funds to pay down debt that the church has, you want to calculate the debt interest that's avoided, or if there's debt on the parsonage that you're paying off, you are having some savings from that as well. So you want to get all of these investment kind of questions out of the way to see if financially it makes sense. Most people will look at, well, we're spending X on a parsonage and we're going to spend Y on a housing allowance, and Y is higher, so why would we want a housing allowance? Or it's costing us so much for deferred maintenance on the parsonage, and we'd have to invest a whole bunch of money in it up front, but you really need to look over the long term for both of those figures. Now, some churches choose to keep their parsonages and then they rent them out, or they keep their parsonages and they repurpose them for other uses. I know in the greater Washington district, they've taken at least one parsonage to date and repurposed it to housing for women coming out of abusive relationships. So that's something to take into consideration. But if you're going to rent your parsonage, you need to realize that you will lose the property tax portion exemption on that portion of your church's property. This is where it gets a little confusing. You do not get a property tax exemption because the church owns the parsonage and that it's church land. No, you get the property tax exemption because the church owns the parsonage that they're providing to their pastor. If you're not providing the parsonage to your pastor, you lose that exemption. You lose that exemption even if another pastor rents the parsonage. If it's not your pastor, it doesn't matter. You lose the exemption even if another church is paying the rent on behalf of their pastor. If it's not your pastor, you lose the exemption. You will lose the exemption even if you charge less than the market value rental rate for a parsonage. I bring all of these up because these are all of the loopholes that churches have approached us at the conference trustees to say, but we're doing this. It doesn't matter. The loss of the exemption is entirely driven by the fact that the church is collecting rent. It doesn't matter if it's $1 a year or $10,000 a year. If you're collecting rent, you lose the property tax exemption on that piece of property. Here's where we get into some legalese. So you can take a minute to read that. There is some cases that a church has taken its parsonage and allowed another pastor to live in it and not charge them any rent. Since rent was not being collected, they were allowed to keep their property tax exemption on the parsonage because a clergy person was living there and no rent was being collected. Can you use it for religious purposes? If you are using the parsonage, Dale, I might need a little bit more details. If you're using the parsonage for church offices, or if you're using the parsonages for church meetings, or if you're using the parsonage for Sunday school classes, if you're using it for worship, yes, then it maintains its property tax exemption. If you are using it to collect rent in order to pay the housing allowance, or collect rent in order to pay anything, you lose the property tax exemption. Having somebody live there and conduct a worship service for their family once a week, I know you didn't ask that, but that might be a loophole that would cause some questions to be asked. So as long as it's like a real worship service, I would say yes. I am not an attorney, so don't hold me to that. Also, if you do rent the parsonage, as this slide says, you need to notify the tax office so that the tax assessment, which your church should be receiving every year anyway, an assessment from your local jurisdiction, and let them know it's now subject to property tax. If you think the amount is too high, every jurisdiction has an appeal process for that. Excuse me for a second. You'll want to notify them, because if they find out and they go back and look at how long you've been renting the parsonage, they could, in some instances, charge you back taxes plus penalties plus interest, and it could be a bill you may not be prepared to pay. But you can also figure the tax burden into the rental price. So if you know you're paying $5,000 a year in taxes, you can incorporate that into your rent, or if you want to be really nice, you can charge them just the tax value for rent each year. You still lose the property tax, but it's not costing you anything either. You should contact a CPA. whoops. I will, when we're finished, I will try to copy that link that Paul gave us, and I'll drop that in the chat when I finish the presentation. But you're going to want to contact a CPA because there is your UBIT taxes, which is unrelated business income tax. So churches that receive income from business purposes, whether it's in this, if it's rental income, and if it's over a certain percentage, you may have to pay business income tax on it. I cannot answer that question, so don't ask me. Contact a CPA and have them help you work through that. Now, restrictions on the proceeds of sale. This is where I would say 95% of our churches get into trouble or have a challenge, and so pay close attention. If you sell the parsonage, you cannot use the proceeds for any current operating expenses, which includes your housing allowance. And for proceeds, I just like round numbers. So if you sell your parsonage and you take in, after everything's been paid out, $100,000, that's your net proceeds. You may not use that for any current operating expenses, including your housing allowance. So the church can't say, well, we've got $100,000 and it's $20,000 a year for housing allowance, so we've got enough to cover us for X number of years. It doesn't work that way. You can't touch that principle. It can be used for capital improvements if adequate provisions have been made to meet the housing needs of the pastor, and to use that money, you have to have consent from the district superintendent. So anecdotally, I served a church that years after I served it, it was part-time while I was there. It went full-time and then back to part-time, and they decided with a part-time clergy person who was not living in the parsonage that they would sell it, and they were prepared to put the proceeds aside for needs for housing. At the same time of the sale, they had a massive sewer backup, and they had to replace all of the sewer plumbing underneath the building, and they got permission from the district superintendent to use the proceeds of the sale to do that capital improvement, because they had a plan for how to cover the housing needs of their part-time clergy person. And the district superintendent at the time signed off on it. But there's all those steps you need to take into consideration before you use the net proceeds for anything other than what the Book of Discipline says you can use them for. Again, they can be used in aiding in the construction of a new church building. Again, you still have to have approval of the district superintendent. They can be used for congregational redevelopment. I know it says development in there, but it can be used for redevelopment. So there are some churches that are in decline. They decide they want to really give an effort to redevelop their congregation and their community. They develop a 3 to 5 year plan, which has to be approved by the annual conference in order to use the net proceeds. Not an easy process, but that is allowed within the Book of Discipline. So when you have these net proceeds, you really need to develop an investment plan. You want to invest it so you have maximized return in support of the housing allowance. And I'm going to go off of Paul and I had this conversation. I might not have these numbers right, but if you do like a 5% draw on your investment a year to be able to pay the housing allowance, you probably need $400,000 to $500,000 in your investment vehicle in order to be able to do that. If you can't do that, then your plan has to be how much can we get from the investment and how much can we put in from our church budget. The example I use on the conference level, we no longer have any district parsonages. At one time, all of our district superintendents lived in district parsonages. That is no longer the case. And so when the conference trustees sold district parsonages, we put those funds into an investment vehicle. We draw on a portion of those funds to cover the budget of the district superintendent's housing allowance, and part is covered from the conference budget. So it's that hybrid that hopefully at some point 100% would be covered by the investments, but until then you should be prepared to use a hybrid method. You'll need to have a formalized investment policy that's laid out in the Book of Discipline of how to set up an investment committee or a foundation within your local church. You want to decide, are we going to handle this locally? Do we have people within our congregation that can make these investment decisions or want to make the investment decisions? Do we want to bring in an outside source like the foundation, the United Methodist Foundation? In what's the formal name, Frank? I always forget.
We're the Mid-Atlantic United.
Mid-Atlantic.
Foundation.
Okay.
The mouthful.
Oh, there we go. The Mid-Atlantic United Methodist Foundation can assist you in developing that investment plan. And I know, on a side note, when my last congregation was looking to develop their investment policy and their foundation plan, Frank came in and gave a presentation to our finance committee and was able to answer questions so that they could set up an investment portfolio at the time. And guess what?
Nice.
That's everything. Unless there's questions. I think the big key takeaway is you have to have permission to sell, and don't spend the money from the sale on anything, the proceeds on anything except capital improvements or potentially for redevelopment. If your church has already sold the parsonage and has been spending the money from the proceeds, you may want to have a conversation with your district superintendent sooner rather than later, before those funds have been spent down to nothing. Because what you'll find is at the end of the term, churches don't have a plan for how are we going to pay the housing allowance once these funds have been depleted. So there you go, Frank.
Excellent. So I'll ask the first question, and then Annabelle, if you want to publish the poll, or I'll publish the poll, and we can talk about that too in polling. Good. Annabelle, why don't you talk about it real quick, and then I've got a question for Bill after that.
Okay, so the poll,
yeah.
I think everybody could see, does your church have a properly established and promoted permanent endowment account, providing a forever third income stream to your church? 40% of you said no, but we need to do something. 30% just said no. So 70% do not. 20% have one, but probably needs some attention. And one person said yes, it's positive help for our finances, which is great. And does your church currently manage a parsonage? 50% yes, but we're interested in exploring selling or renting, which no doubt is why you were on this webinar. 20% are actively selling or renting, and 20% are happy with their current status.
Thanks.
We do actually have a question that came in. Can you briefly mention the rules and strategy for a merger and sale of property afterwards?
You're muted, Bill.
Bill, you're muted.
I know, I'm talking to myself.
Okay, good.
Yes, Ben Rigsby is asking that question. Haha, I'm going to throw you under the bus. It depends on the type of merger you're talking about, Ben. And the reason I say that is there are just such a variety. People get scared by the word merger. We like to use the term vital merger, where two healthy congregations have decided to come together. And in some instances, I know from around the connection, we have healthy churches that are merging, selling all of their properties and starting fresh. And so again, you'd want to still follow those steps within the Book of Discipline. It becomes a little bit easier if you're not selling parsonages or selling church buildings because of the restrictions that are placed on those. But a lot of times I look at it as perhaps a merger. Some use the terminology of a wedding because you are blending families together. And so you kind of want to use some of those same strategies of getting to know one another, getting to know each other's core values, getting to know each other's mission, seeing where the commonalities are. So it's not a hostile takeover or an us versus them. and that takes time. Some churches have found it helpful to have written covenants of how you're going to come together and what steps that you're going to take. And I am happy and to talk offline about this, because there's a lot of details which don't have to do with sales, because some churches decide not to sell any of their properties once they merge. And again, it depends on what the property is being used for currently that determines what you can do with the proceeds afterwards. Okay.
Do you see those other questions, Bill? There's one that says,
I'm looking in.
yeah, it says, are there any restrictions on use of the proceeds from renting a parsonage, assuming there's a positive cash flow?
No, there is no restrictions on using rental income. That is considered regular active income that can be used for current operating expenses, can be used for mission, whatever the church decides. It's only from the net proceeds of a sale that the restrictive clauses come into play. Trying to look.
Well, what we do see in the investment side of that, Bill, is often people have not planned for the roof repair, the plumbing repairs, the longer term things. So it looks like excess cash flow on the immediacy, but if you're paying a $12,000 long-term roof repair and you're generating in excess of $2,000 a year, and it looks like you can, you're managing that, you have to remember there is a day that every house wears out, every plumbing needs to be repaired, every tree needs to be taken down. And these are things that you're managing that property. I just got a quote to take a tree down on my property. It was $5,000. That would blow a budget for a lot of our churches that at one time look like they have an excess of returns. And the first thing the church wants to do is come in and spend the principal to go and take care of that emergent condition. Also, we find out that some people have not insured it properly for tenants to be in the building. That the tenant may have to have renter's insurance, but they didn't know that. And then an event happens, a water leak, some event, and they expect the church to cover their loss because they were renting the parsonage and it was not in good condition or something, and there becomes a tension between the renter. It's tough to be a landlord, and that, again, what's the purpose that you're setting out to do?
And I would add to that, Jack, when and or if you're renting, I know we're churches, you still need to have a lease. It still needs to be in writing. Expectations need to be written down.
Right.
Nods and handshakes just don't cover it anymore. And those types of instances that you're talking about are dealt with in those lease agreements. And I know from the annual conference level of the trustees, we've had property that we have rented out to other churches. We still have a very firm lease agreement, just so that everybody knows what the expectations are. And again, we have another question that came in about rental income. There are no restrictions on the rental income. So if you're bringing in rent and there's mortgage on the property, you can use the rental income to pay the mortgage. It can be used for current operating expenses. What I hear you saying, Jack, is if we're getting X number of dollars in a month from rent, we should probably be setting some of that aside into a capital improvement fund for the property, so that when those unexpected or even expected repairs come up, you have funds available in order to cover those. Hold on a second. Two people working from one home. You have to share sometimes.
Good.
So probably, Frank, you asked a question. What are some problems that people have had when renting or trying to sell? The same problems any landlord or anybody who is selling a piece of property is going to have. There are some people who think because you're a church, they're going to try to take advantage and lowball offers on the sale of the house, or there will be people who will do a home inspection and expect you as a seller to fix X, Y, and Z if it's not listed as an as-is sale. highly recommend that you use a qualified licensed real estate, a realtor or real estate attorney. And even if you have some in your congregation, while I support local businesses and business owners within congregations, you just want to make sure that that won't cause friction with an individual if something goes sour in the sale or in the rental. I've known some churches who use property management companies to handle all of the rental and property fixes, and there's a fee, that's involved in that you can recoup from the rent. But then the church isn't having to send a trustee over in the middle of the night if there's a flood, or the church doesn't have to be responsible for XYZ because the property management company takes care of that. I also see a question about the property tax exemption. If a part of the parsonage is being rented out, I would contact a CPA for that answer. Potentially, yes, there could be some tax implications or portions of the tax implications that are affected by renting out a part of the parsonage. I'd double check with a CPA or an attorney just to be sure you're on the safe side. And again, you want to know that up front, because if a local jurisdiction finds out, they will 9 times out of 10 not only charge you the current tax rate, but they will go back to see how long you've been renting it out and charge you penalties and interests. And unless you have that laying around, you want to be better safe than sorry.
Awesome. Great answers. I'm going to share just the contact info, if you can see that real quick for us. So you're welcome to contact us. We've got all the information right there. Jack Brooks, that's his email and phone number, my email and phone number, and Annamel's email and phone number too. So feel free.
I'm gonna throw into the chat one more, if I can spell it correctly.
This webinar, as Frank mentioned, is recorded and will be up on our website. And we can also put the PowerPoint slides up there so people have those resources available.
And if I spelled it correctly, there's Paul's,
Very good.
That looks right.
Berger's email address.
It's
If
good.
you have some of those financial questions, I'm gonna see if I can copy and paste that.
While he's doing that, Jack, do you have any last thoughts as we wrap this up?
I think when you set up this, and as Bill pointed out, there's a lot that goes into the front end, and also the long-term management on the back end. Churches always have to have a succession of people that come into groups and committees. And it is not unusual that 5 years after the sale of a parsonage and the funds are being managed and a new group is working with the church and volunteering and on committees, they really need to be constantly educated about what that purpose was in the rules, because they're looking to manage a church financially, and it sometimes appears that, well, we have this big pile of money from this and let's go and spend it, and those funds are going to be restricted. And that group needs to understand that it's to buy another parsonage in the event that has to happen in the future. And so you sold a parsonage for $300,000 10 years ago, and that bought a house in the area. But within the next 10 years, house may be $400,000. You've had to you spend all the income. It's not just about maintaining the principal, because now the church has to come up with additional funds in a capital campaign or something to go out and buy another parsonage. So it's this is time tested in the Book of Discipline. This is not something that was created in the last few years. And I think the difference is we sort of understand it too at the foundation. We deal with like situations. Many other churches where just putting the money in a bank, the bank doesn't know anything about parsonages versus cemeteries versus scholarship versus endowments or operating accounts. We manage sometimes 7, 8, 9 different accounts for churches. And that's all because we keep pockets separate in the Methodist Church. We do capital campaigns and so on. So sometimes there's unintended consequences. That's the most difficult thing for churches to explore. But if you've got the plan, as Bill pointed out, to really be thought-filled, understand the risk, reward, the trade-offs that you have, you can proceed with caution, and you have a great group of advisors. So often we hear after the fact that a church decided to sell a property and never followed any of these things, and that's just it puts everybody into a very difficult situation. So early intervention, early getting your thoughts together, presenting the information allows everybody to make great choices, including in the long-term management of this. I know Ben asked on the thoughts on the average investment gains. Our long-term performance in a balanced account situation, stocks, bonds, cash, stocks today may be 70% of the portfolio. Fixed income, as we heard the Federal Reserve yesterday say they're keeping interest rates at near zero for many years to come. Fixed income's not going to get you there. So when you're looking and saying you need this long-term return, we've been able to achieve around 7% for the long term. Now, remember that may be spending the 4 or 5% that we talked about for income, and the rest has to stay there for inflation. As I just said about the house example, a house price goes up over time. If you own a home, you understand that what you paid for it is much different than what you anticipate selling it for. So all these are factors that when you're calculating investments, you want to know not only what is it today, but what can we anticipate and be on track, and check that periodically, at least annually, to make sure we're on track for the spending that we anticipate. And that's part of the projection and decision making.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Bill, last questions, thoughts?
I would go back to, I served on trustees for 8 years, 2 different books of discipline. These sections of the discipline did not change. They haven't changed much over the years on the sales. You really want to follow them closely, because on all of your property, it is implied that there is a trust clause. And that can sometimes hinder the sale. So if you follow all of the steps, you get all of the right consent, then that is what can remove the trust clause from the deeds for the purpose of the sale. So just make sure you follow all of those steps closely. And of course, if you have questions, that's what district boards of church and location are supposed to be able to answer for you. So you reach out to them and they can help answer those questions as well.
That's awesome. I just want to thank Jack and Annabelle for helping me today. Thank all of our attendees for showing up. I said this will be put on our website for future use. And in particular, our speaker today, Reverend Bill Brown, who's just did a tremendous job. Thank you so much for the extra research. I know you put this together, and all your willingness to help out the kingdom. So we appreciate that too very much. So
I do see a question came in.
Go ahead.
Would a church be able to borrow against the proceeds?
Yes. One of the things that we've been able to do at this special time is we created a $50 million line of credit for our clients of the foundation. We did this back in April of this year in anticipation that economic times may be difficult, and people did not want to be forced to sell investments at that time to generate return. Now, the market has been up this year and down this year. So over time, we know the market will perform well. But borrowing is the exact same part of the equation. Interest rates are incredibly low right now. So we went out and established a $50 million line of credit. Our client churches can borrow up to half of that value. It does not affect the account or the purpose, but it is a lien on that account to be sold at a future time. The theory is if you're paying a low interest rate on your payments, but you have a greater chance of earning over time, it balances that out. And again, that's a specialized area where we need to make sure that everybody understands that obligation. It's available to people. It's mostly just to carry you till the time that you could have a higher value in the account and close out that. It's a short-term line of credit, not a long-term forever indebtedness.
I'm going to add to that, Jack, because that is the formal professional answer. On the local church side, I know there are local churches who will say, we have X number of dollars in our parsonage sale fund. Let's borrow against that, and not, it's all done locally. If you do that, I would put I'm not recommending it, but you should still put everything in writing, consult with your district superintendent so that they know what's going on, so that 10 years down the road, when you have a whole new set of church officers, they know what was done and what the expectations for paying that back. So again, I would check with your district superintendent if you're trying to do it locally, just within your own budget, but make sure you put everything into writing, even if that's the case.
We do not access that lending privilege without the church entering into a program with us about the debt repayment program. And that's very important to know. So we don't want anybody to get into trouble. That's why even there, the line is at half of a maximum of half of the value. Oftentimes, these things are very short term. We have a cash flow problem. We anticipate this. We need a bridge to get to that. We're going to pay for a heating system over the next 4 years, but it's cold and we need the heating system now. And so debt is not bad if it's managed well. Many people have a home equity line with a zero balance on their house for the same purpose. My tree project, as I said, a $5,000 tree removal, it's a little more than I carry around in my wallet, but it may need to be done. And so therefore, do I want to access a line of credit and say, I'll have 10 months to pay this back or something like that? It really is a very fluid and a very successful way to manage it, but you do need advice about not encumbering the church more than it possibly could pay back over time.
That's great.
Yep.
All right. So once again, I want to thank all of our pastors for attending, and you guys are on the front lines for our kingdom, and we appreciate it. All the panelists, Bill today in particular, thank you for your help. And
you're welcome. Anytime, Frank.
God bless everybody in your work.